In today's video, I continue my journey through the main questline featured in the Elder Scrolls 3, Morrowind. Last time, I learned of a 6th house base near the village of Narmok and investigated it. Inside of the Hlaalu caverns, I found 6th house servants, corpus stalkers, a 6th house shrine, and a 6th house priest, Dagoth Gers. After defeating Gers, I contracted Corpus and was told by many that I should be left for dead. Instead, Caius sent me to a place called Tel Fur, where I met with the wizard Devaithfur. Devaith administered me a potion that would either cure the disease or kill me on the spot. Drinking it, I beat the odds and was actually cured of the negative side effects for Corpus, leaving only the positive ones, and thereby fulfilling the second Nerevarine trial. In between that, I did get to meet the last living dwarf, Yagran Bagarn, who shared stories of lore, history, and theories with me. Returning back to Caius and Balmora, he informed me that he was being recalled back to the Imperial City and that I would now be on my own. My last set of orders from him was to meet again with Meyra Milo and Vivek, as she might know more of the so-called lost prophecies. Whilst in the city, I discovered that she was taken prisoner and brought over to the Ministry of Truth. I infiltrated the meteor, broke into the prison area, and gave Meyra Milo a scroll of divine intervention. From there, I met with her again in the sanctuary of Hlaalu, home to the dissident priests. She directed me to their leader, Gilvas Barelo, who informed me about the lost prophecies, the 7 curses, and Kagranak's tools. This is where the adventure continues. I was pretty sure I knew how to leave here, but double checking, I spoke again with Barelo. He confirmed that I need to speak with Vivrana Aryan at the docks in order to sail back to Ebonheart. Exiting the sanctuary, I must have left just after dawn because the entrance ended up sealing, leaving me trapped inside. But I simply waited for dusk and paid 40 gold for a boat ride back to the southern islands. From here, I spoke with the ferryman, Navosi Hlan, for passage back to the foreign quarter of Vivek. Then finally, I paid the caravaner to take me back to Sedanin. Admittedly, there's a bit of a time gap in between this moment here and the actual continuation of the main questline. Here's a little bit of insight into what I did in the meantime. I went off to the Ascadian Isles and the West Gash regions in order to embark on some side quests. Along the way, I encountered my first dreamer on the side of the road. He was just standing there eyeing the fork, almost as if he was waiting for my arrival. He wasn't immediately aggressive. I was able to actually speak with him. He spoke of the topics that the dreamers talked about, that Dagoth and the 6th house are reawakened, that Morrowind will be freed from the Outlanders and foreign rule, and also that Red Mountain is where he and his servants reside. Believe it or not, I was actually the one to start the fight. A little bit because I knew he had to go, and mostly because I wanted to train my spear skill. This brings me to my next point on the laundry list of things that I needed to do. I really meant it when I said I was fed up with my current skill levels, particularly that of my ability whilst using a spear. I checked out some trainers, but they charged way too much for only a 1-point advancement. I then decided to go in and around the dungeons of Balmora to clear out everything that I could. This is where I came up with what I believe to be a true Morrowind strategy. While exploring the Shulk egg mine, I came across some aggressive miners. They were attacking me with pickaxes, which really didn't do a lot of damage. What started out as a simple fight to the death turned into this poor miner becoming my personal training dummy. I would continuously swing away with my spear, purposefully using the weakest strikes in order to preserve this Dunmer's health. When his health was low, I would back out of the zone, rest until we were both healed, and repeat the process over and over again. My spear skill was rapidly increasing, along with my light armor skill, and before I knew it, I was advancing up a couple of levels. I repeated this process for quite some time until my spear was by far the highest leveled major skill, and that even with low fatigue, I would still have a decent chance at landing a hit. Once I was satisfied, I left the mines and returned to Balmora. Rararin Radaris, the self-proclaimed sleeper of the town, finally snapped and decided to come after me. He was of little challenge, and I ended up defeating him using only my spear, which I did feel pretty good about. With all of that out of the way, the main questline officially continues from here. I knew I had to return back to the Urshilaku camp to the north of here, but I really wasn't looking forward to it. It was a bit of a trek last time, and to be honest, my slow pace around the province is starting to bore me. I did have a fix in mind for that though. From Balmora, I took a Silt Strider to Alderun, then from Alderun to Nissus, forgetting that my final destination was actually Margon. It was from Margon, though, that I began to travel in arguably the most fun way. The Ikarian flight scrolls from earlier were just too useful and handy for getting around to places. So, during my training arc, I made a slightly nerfed spell version of them. I call it Go Places, a very creative name, and similar to the scrolls, I can leap a massive distance with it. Then, just before I land, I cast a slow fall spell and am able to safely land back down. The only caveat to this though is that I only have enough magicka for one cast of each spell. So sometimes, if I'm unlucky, I fail the leaping spell and have to reset. Other times, I'm really unlucky and fail the slow fall spell, resulting in my character's death most of the time. Once I've landed, I have to rest until healed, which isn't always possible as I may have aggroed some enemies either in the air or on the ground. Regardless of all the little flaws and things that could go wrong, it's honestly the least mind-numbing and most fun way for me to travel. In just a couple of leaps, I made it to the Urshilaku camp and entered inside of Nabani Mesa's yurt.
Is there something you need?
She welcomed me by saying I could ask her any questions about the prophecies, and said that I could hand over any information on the Lost Ones. Inquiring about the Lost Prophecies, Nabani Mesa claims that she wants to study them and learn them by heart. These are the ancient beliefs of her cult, and she's going to make her best judgment on them. She technically tells me to come back for her opinion on my standing with the prophecies, but I can't wait and ask for it right away. To my delight, Nabani Mesa delivers her judgment. She believes in the lost prophecies and comes to understand that the incarnate will indeed be an outlander. This verdict allows her to openly endorse my claim, and she offers to be my guide on the harrowing journey ahead. She understands that I have passed the first trial, born on a certain day to uncertain parents. Her dreams have showed her that I've passed the second trial, that neither blight nor age can harm me, and that the curse of flesh flies before me. Yet, she isn't sure how that is. I go on to tell her my experience with contracting corpus, and getting the negative side effects cured at Tel Fur, therefore keeping the immunity to disease and age. Nabani Mesa is amazed to hear this and confirms that I've passed the second trial. She goes on to explain that the third isn't one that she can share with me. Instead, Sol Matul will be the one to tell me about it. I quickly ask for a reminder on the third trial, and she says that it has to do with the Shrine of Azura and the Cavern of the Incarnate. Leaving Mesa's yurt, I go to the Ashkans and enter inside.
Is there something you need?
Speaking with Sol Matul about the third trial, he still has trouble believing that I'm the Nerevarine. He takes Mesa's word into deep consideration, but still holds his own opinions on the matter. He decides it best to send me on one of his own tests. He wants to see if I have the strength, courage, and cunning needed by the Nerevarine. He tells me he wants me to go to the forgotten ground of Kogoruhn, a former 6th house sanctuary of sorts. He's been there recently, and what he found disturbed him. There were many creatures of blight, which indicates something worse is going on. He asks for 3 tokens from the ancient halls, as proof of my abilities and powers. One is corpus weepings from a being with corpus, as proof of my immunity. The second is a cup with the marking of House Dagoth. Sol Matul has personally seen many of these in Kogoruhn, and it's evidence that I have laid eyes on the horrors within. The third is much trickier to obtain. The Shadow Shield lies deep beneath Kogoruhn in the tomb of Dagoth Morin. Once I have all 3 items, Sol Matul will tell me the secrets of the third test. I ask about the stronghold of Kogoruhn, and he marks it on my map, giving me specific instructions on how to get there. Exiting the yurt, I located the 6th house hall on the map and began to line it up for my leaps. Again, this seems like the most convenient way of travel right now. The only thing I do feel negatively about is not noticing the world around me. As a new player, going to these new areas, it's always a good idea to stop and take it all in, as you never know what you might find. But I justify it by saying that I'm in it for the long haul when it comes to playing this game. There's always going to be time and a reason to go exploring. Switching back and forth between Go Places and Tanur's Hoptoad, I eventually landed just outside of Kogoruhn. Approaching the base of it, I was aggroed onto by a dreamer. It wasn't anything too difficult to handle, but it showed me that this place is likely teeming with 6th house servants. On the base platform, there are a variety of different entrances into different buildings. Two of them were smaller structures, the third was a medium-sized one, and the fourth seemingly led into the main stronghold. I first checked out one of the smaller ones, called Dome of Pollux Eye. On the inside, there was a 6th house priest. He looked similar to Dagoth Gers and performed the same attacks. It was at this moment though, I became very confident in my ability to use a spear, as it was the moveset that carried me through this fight. This one's name was apparently Dagoth Girer, and all he had on his body was a 6th house amulet. I looked around the Pollux Eye and honestly didn't find too much. There was some strange writing on the floor, apparently written in Daedric. I looked up and conveniently, right above the runes, there was a House Dagoth cup. This was one of the 3 tokens that I needed. Snagging it, I continued to look around the dome when I noticed corpse sweepings on the floor. The weepings were another one of the tokens in which I needed for Solmatul. Collecting it, I only needed to find the Shadow Shield now. Leaving the Pollux Eye, I entered into the Dome of Urso. Inside, there was a creature in which I've never seen before. At first, I thought it was a Slode, but upon closer inspection, it had differing features. The monster used all sorts of destruction magic, and honestly, I died a lot to this thing. My winning play was to evade around the central column. Doing this long enough, it gave up on using magic. At this point, it would just run around the circle, chasing after me, and I was able to poke and prod it with my spear until it died. This being was called Dagoth Railer, and to be honest, I thought it was really neat how these things were once bosses, but are now just higher level enemies. I looked around the dome in case the shield was around here too, although I doubted it would be. I came across some Comic Sans writing saying that the Dreamer is awake. Some research would show that the Daedric runes and Pollux Eye actually say the same message. It was obvious the shield wasn't in here, so I exited this area and made my way into the main stronghold. Starting out in the Hall of Fisto, this area was rather small and contained only a few enemies, mainly Corpus Stalkers and another 6th house priest. Dagoth Delnus, as he was called, was built just like Dagoth Gers, and I dealt with him just as easily as the others. The room in which Delnus resided contained a parchment of scrawlings. I glossed it over, but it mostly sounded like the ramblings of a madman. It was also just statements that I've already heard regarding the 6th house and Dagoth Ur. Inside the Hall of Fisto, I also encountered my true nemesis, an Ash Slave. These things beat me up bad in the Elunaby caverns, but this time I felt a little more equipped to deal with them. The next area I went into was the Hall of Maki. Immediately, I discovered a 6th house shrine and an Ash Slave guarding it. After defeating it, I made my way further into the hall and encountered my very first Flame Atronach. They're certainly a lot more menacing than what we see in Skyrim and Oblivion. Admittedly, this thing killed me quite a few times. Eventually, I baited it into close quarter combat and struck it with my spear. Otherwise, frost magic did the trick really well and I could defeat it with 2 casts. I moved along the halls pretty nicely, soon making it to a zone called the Nabith Waterway. This area was like a sewer tunnel. It felt fairly straightforward and looked like there weren't a whole lot of paths that would deviate away. Down here, I faced my first Frost Atronach, which was easy to take care of with fire magic. I also fought against an Ash Zombie, which felt like the easiest variant of both a Dreamer and an Ash Slave. Further in the waterway, I battled against another priest called Dagoth Oralis. I was surprised at the sheer amount of them in this area. I would have guessed that they were a rarer type of enemy to come across, but seemingly not. Eventually, I found myself in a zone called Karma's Breath. This place is spelt with a CH, but Karma feels more on the money than Charma. I'm probably wrong here, but moving along, this place felt like I was getting closer to the Shadow Shield. It was a cavernous region with lava pools scattered throughout, similar to what Solmatul described I would see. One of the first enemies down here was a Greater Bonewalker. During my spear training arc, I fought one of these things and it left me stranded inside of an ancestral tomb, as it completely depleted my strength. I tried to keep as much distance as possible so that way it couldn't make contact. I relentlessly unleashed a lot of fire magic, killing it as quickly as possible. Further along, I encountered a really unique enemy, one to which I haven't seen the likes of before. It would cast some form of touch magic but struggled to land any hits. Not wanting to find out what the spell did, I backtracked a bunch until I ended up accidentally cheesing the fight. This thing got stuck in between a rock and the lava, until eventually it fell straight into the magma pits. Its health rapidly drained and then succumbed to its damage, disappearing into the Molten. I was a little disappointed I didn't get to loot it, or at least learn what it was, but I guess that's the consequence of finding loopholes. So as a side note, only researching it now, I just learned that this was a powerful ash vampire named Dagoth Uthul. Uthul, as it turns out, actually could have spoken with me, and there were some options to take from there. Killing him though has its perks, as apparently it will help me down the line. He did carry a powerful and useful enchanted belt, called the Belt of Hearthfire. I'm slightly bummed I missed out on that one. Also, it's a good thing that I didn't let him land a hit, as he does some pretty crazy damage to the player's attributes. Continuing along, there was a door which led to the Red Mountain. I didn't think that's where I needed to go though. I fought plenty more priests until I ended up at a zone called Bleeding Heart. This was the final area in which I needed to be in. There were some of the same enemies in here, Flame Atronachs, Ash Slaves, and 6th House Priests. This area was a lot more straightforward and wrapped around in a loop. Towards the back of it, I stumbled upon a shrine which contained a lot of really valuable and useful loot. Some highlights were Daedric Gauntlets, a Master Lockpick, an Orc Warhammer, and of course, the Shadow Shield. Final token in hand, it was finally time to leave this place. Going back out into Karma's Breath, I decided to try the exit into the Red Mountain region instead of backtracking to the beginning. This Red Mountain area was pretty intense. It was dark, there was a dust storm, the sky was crimson red, and the wind was deafening. I attempted to leap my way back to the Hlaalu camp, only to make a grave discovery. I was actually inside of the Ghost Fence, the magical barrier intended to keep all things inside of the Red Mountain area. Spaced out along the way were a lot of ash zombies. Again, not the hardest creatures to beat, but their presence made it impossible to rest until healed. This was bad because I was out of magicka and had no way to cross over the Ghost Fence. Luckily for me, I had one potion of Rising Force left. Popping it, I was relieved when it allowed me to levitate over the barrier and make it back onto the less intimidating side. From here, I leapt all the way back to the Hlaalu camp. Along the way, I caught the attention of more than a few enemies, but most of them were more nuisance than challenge. Arriving at Sulmatul's yurt, I spoke with him about the third test. He asked for the 3 tokens, in which I handed over. He was impressed with my efforts and deemed that I had passed his trial. He then gave me the secret of the third trial, saying, "In caverns dark, Azura's eye sees and makes to shine the moon and star." He tells me I must go to the cavern incarnate to look for the moon and star. The cavern's location is a riddle, however. He says, the eye of the needle lies in the teeth of the wind. The mouth of the cave lies in the skin of the pearl. The dream is the door, and the star is the key. Sulmatul tells me that this is the test of wisdom. I should ask the rest of the tribespeople for any clues on how to decipher the puzzle and find the cavern incarnate. He ends off by handing me Malapu Adaman's belt, a sacred enchanted piece. I leave the yurt and enter inside of Nabani Mesas. I begin to ask her questions on the riddle. For the star is the key, she tells me that Azura's star only shines during the hours of dawn and dusk. For the dream is the door, she connects the dots and says that the entrance can only be accessed during the hours in which Azura's star shines. Unfortunately, that's the only information she's able to provide me with. This is where I went to seek out more knowledge from the tribal folk. First, I spoke with someone named Shaleth Pyramus. She comments on how I have Malapu Adaman's belt, which is an important artifact to the Hlaalu people. Shaleth then freely explains the skin of the pearl and what it could mean. She mentions the needle first, and how it's in the Valley of the Wind. Just underneath the needle is a secure campground. Atop the needle, she clarifies that there's a whitish rock, which could be interpreted as a pearl. I inquire further about the Valley of the Wind. She tells me it's side by side with another called the Dry Camp Valley by Red Mountain. She mentions that the Valley of the Wind runs straight south of a place called Aran's Teeth. Both of these valleys are to the east and by the coast. She mentions landmarks of Thuend and Zerganopol. Asking around the other clan members, Tsuradad informs me that the Eye of the Needle is a tall rock column. It seems as though Aran's Teeth is the Teeth of the Wind represented by 2 rock spires. The needle is located in the Valley of the Wind and is represented by a pillar of rock. The pearl is located at a sheltered and secure area by the needle, and it's a discolored rock. To be honest, at the time I was still a little confused on how to make it there, but I did have the ruin of Zerganopol marked on my map. So that was going to be my starting place. I leapt all the way to the ruin and turned south as per the directions I received. I encountered what I believed to be a red herring of sorts, but most likely was just a lack of understanding on my part. There was a perfectly carved out pathway leading to a dead end. At the end of it were some oddly shaped rocks. I thought for quite some time that this had to be the entrance inside of the cave. I waited for both dusk and dawn numerous times, looked all around, but to no avail. I eventually decided to keep looking, as nothing was really happening here. Recapping the directions and instructions given, I went east of Zirconopol by the coast. Rounding the corner, I noticed a long and narrow valley. I couldn't tell right off the bat if this was either the Valley of the Wind or Dry Camp Valley. Regardless, I decided to go down it. There were a couple of rock spires that could have been Aaron's teeth, but I had already mistaken a separate path for the correct one. I walked for a good long while. The road was mostly empty and void of life. Eventually, it began to wind and twist. I was slowly losing faith that this was the right area. To my delight though, I came up on the end of the path and laid eyes on a remarkable doorway, clad in stars and moons. Approaching it and interacting with it, I heard this.
The door is locked and will not open. The star is the key.
The current time was 8 a.m., so I rested until 7 p.m. and tried again.
In the dawn hour under Azura's star, the door is opened.
Entering inside the cavern incarnate, I had no idea what to expect, and therefore was extremely cautious. It was a small zone though, and located in the center was a massive statue, seemingly of Azura. I had a quick look around and noticed a lot of mummified bodies and mushrooms. Floating in the hands of the statue was a beautiful ring. This was the Ring of the Moon and Star, which fortifies personality and speechcraft each for 5 points. More importantly, this was the end of the third trial. Picking it up triggered this cutscene.
Nerevar reborn, incarnate. Your first 3 trials are finished. Now 2 new trials lie before you. Seek the Ashlander, Ashcans, and the Great House Councillors. 4 tribes must name you Nerevarine. 3 houses must name you Hortator. My servant, Nabani Mesa, shall be your guide. And when you are Hortator and Nerevarine, when you have stood before the false gods and freed the heart from its prison, heal my people and restore Morrowind. Do this for me, and with my blessing.
Receiving that heavy and intense message, the way forward is clear. I must be named Hortator of the Great Houses and Nerevarine of the Ashlander tribes. Before leaving, I noticed that all of the mummified bodies now have spirits standing by them. They're all seemingly friendly, so I spoke with one of them, Peakstar. She introduced herself as not the one, but she waits and hopes for the person that is. She said I could ask her some questions, and I did. Although I didn't really receive any new information on the topics I was already familiar with. I did ask her though about not being the one. Apparently, all of the spirits in this cave are those who have tried to fulfill the Nerevarine prophecies, but have failed. Peakstar apparently died to an ash vampire and wasn't able to be named Hortator. She ended up gifting me some clothing though, as she won't be needing it any longer. In fact, speaking with all of the spirits and asking for their story, they talk about how they died during their trials, and in the end, gift me their once prized possessions. From here, I exit the cavern and leap back to the Urshilaku camp. Funny enough, I bought the recall spell, not knowing that I needed the mark spell. I was really excited to be able to conveniently teleport back to camp, but once again, my lack of knowledge got the better of me. I jumped the gun a bit and went to Nabani Mesa first instead of Sulmatul. I began asking her all these questions about the prophecies, the great houses, becoming Hortator, etc. Then I remembered that Sulmatul was the one who gave me the quest in the first place, so I went and spoke with him. He greets me by confirming I have passed the third trial. He asks if I wish to be called Urshilaku Nerevarine, but first offers me a bit of counsel. I accept it, and he goes on to say that the Nerevarine title will bring a lot of attention, most of it negative. The temple and its followers, the sixth house, the great houses, they're all likely to turn their back on me and even become hostile. He wisely recommends that I be named Hortator first, before receiving the title of Nerevarine. He then goes on to say that Nabani Mesa can offer me a lot of information on the other Ashland tribes, namely their locations and ways of life. With that out of the way, I ask him to name me Urshilaku Nervarine. He declares that before he does so, he needs to tell me the differences of need and duty. The former, Silmatul describes as knowing the words of the prophecies, the curse of Dagoth-Ur in the 6th house, the false gods, as well as the moon and star. He says that these proofs are needed to display that I am the Urshilaku Nervarine. As for the latter, duty, he goes on to mention becoming the Hortator and the Nervarine. He talks about eating the sin of the unmourned house, aka defeating Dagoth-Ur, and freeing the false gods from their curse, aka the tribunal. Finally, understanding the responsibilities that come with this title, Silmatul names me Urshilaku Nervarine. He hands me the teeth of the Urshilaku as a symbol of their endorsement. He tells me that the Urshilaku will follow me to my death, until the enemy is ultimately defeated, or until I give him back the teeth. Exiting the conversation, I take a look inside of my inventory and see that the teeth of the Urshilaku is an enchanted amulet. It has the power of resisting paralysis for 10%. With that, thus ends the quest, The Path of the Incarnate. Returning back to Nabani Mesa, I ask her about the 4th trial. She reiterates that it entails being named Hortator of the 3 great houses, stating, a stranger's voice unites the houses, 3 halls call him Hortator. Inquiring further about the title, she says that I must speak with the Redoran counselors, Hlaalu counselors, and the Telvanni counselors. Each sect must individually grant me Hortator status, and all of the counselors must be unanimous in their decision. I ask about the counselors of each house, and Mesa tells me that those of Redoran can be located in Uldrun. Balmora contains those of House Hlaalu, and Sadrith Mora holds the counselors of House Telvanni. Leaving her yurt, I use my last Almsivi intervention scroll and get transported to the town of Nissus. From Nissus, I return to the town of Balmora and dumped all of my extra gear at the local merchants. It's funny that even though Caius is now gone, Balmora still feels like my safety blanket and comfort zone. I'm sure there are better merchants and shops out there, but Balmora feels as close to home as it gets in this game. I did go back to Caius' old house in order to rest in his bed. Upon doing so, I abruptly woke up to yet another dream. In this one, Dagoth-Ur spoke out to me and called me Lord Nerevar Endoril. He's direct and asks me to join him at Red Mountain. Together, he wants to free Resdayn of the foreign influence and all of its outlanders. I ignored the dream and his influence and went back to sleep. This is where I woke up again, but to an even scarier message. It said that I had heard a noise and there was a presence of something else in the room. I turned around and was immediately attacked by an ash zombie. I didn't understand how it made it into Caius' home undetected, but figured that was beyond my explanation anyways. I guessed that this was going to become a new thing. Not only the dreams from Dagoth-Ur, but his servants coming to attack me as I tried to sleep. It wasn't too tricky to defeat though, and as for finally getting some rest, the 3rd time was the charm. Leaving the house, I quickly went to the alchemist and finally played around with brewing potions. I managed to make a few which restored my magicka. From here, I then visited the Hlaalu Council Manor. Inside, I spoke with someone named Neleno Dorvain. Neleno asked me what business I had here, and I responded by inquiring about the Hlaalu counselors. She handed me a recent edition of the Yellow Book of Great House Hlaalu. Inside, it lists the current counselors and where to find them. She then says there's a little more information she can give me, but it'll cost 50 gold. I pay up and she tells me the man I want to speak with is Crassius Curio in Vivec. He has a house in the Hlaalu Plaza section. Leaving the council manor, I took a Silt Strider over to the city of Vivec. For full transparency, I did use the unofficial Elder Scrolls wiki at certain points for this quest as a reference. I'm glad I did too, or the amount of time it took me to finish this task would have likely doubled. Admittedly, it took me quite some time to locate the Hlaalu district. Apparently, each house has their own canton. I'd only ever explored a few sections of the city though, and it takes me forever to get around. After roughly 12 minutes or so of wandering, I finally found the Hlaalu Plaza. I located Curio Manor and entered inside. Crassius Curio was in the lower section of the house. He was standing alone in a room, so I approached and spoke with him.
Come on, I haven't got all day, you know.
He introduced himself and oddly tells me to call him Uncle Crassius. Asking about him, he says that when I say his name, it's like music to his ears. I asked about business and he said he couldn't discuss it with anyone who wasn't a member of the house, now calling me sweetie. I then inquired about the Hlaalu Hortator. He spoke of the position highly, and I was then prompted to ask how they're selected, or to tell him my story, and asked to be confirmed as the Hortator. I chose the latter, and Uncle Crassius delivers a forward response. He says that someone named Orvas Dren doesn't want me to become the Hortator. Without this person's endorsement, many of the other counselors won't budge on their opinions either. He then says that 1,000 gold pieces is likely to sway his opinion though. My only two options from here were to stall for time or to hand over the drakes. I had the money on me, so I just went ahead with it. He thanks me for the gold in a snarky and sarcastic manner. He tells me that I have his vote for the title of Hortator. He then offers me a little suggestion. I hear him out and he says that I can likely persuade Dren for support pretty easily. That is, if I can find him. Supposedly, he lives somewhere here in the city. As for Nevena Ulis and Velanda Omani, he says that Orvas Dren commands them and tells them what to do. So, in order to persuade them, I'll need to speak with him first. Dren is apparently the head of the Kimona Tong. Curio remarks that he might be bribed or tricked into getting what I need out of him. He hates the Empire and apparently he has ties to the 6th house. Uncle Crassius gives me directions to both Nevena and Velanda's manors. As for Yngling Half-Troll, none of the other counselors feel much love for him. I'm told that they wouldn't even mind if I killed him. He then tells me to find him in the St. Olms district of Vivec. Exiting the conversation, that's the canton I shot straight for. Entering inside of the St. Olms Plaza and locating Yngling Manor, I find Half-Troll and begin to speak with him.
Someone should teach you some manners.
He asks if I'm a pilgrim and if I'm looking for anyone in particular. I inquire about the Hlaalu Hortator, in which I'm prompted to tell my story and ask for his vote. He says it's a nice one, but without 2,000 gold forked over, I don't get his endorsement. I sat and thought about it for quite some time. I only wanted to use violence as a last resort, but 2,000 drakes was incredibly steep. I looked up if Yngling Half-Troll had any relevancy to the rest of the game. It turns out he does, and whether that's a minor or major role, it didn't matter to me. I paid the hefty sum of money and received his vote for Hortator. Exiting the conversation, I now wanted to try and locate Dren, who was somewhere here in the city. The Yellow Book claims that he has no address attached to him, but I asked around amongst the locals and they all claimed to see him in this plaza before. So I cased every single building to see if he was hiding out somewhere. I couldn't find him in any manor, shop, or establishment. That is, until I decided to check in the so-called St. Olms Haunted Manor. Despite its name, I didn't actually encounter any spirits. The upstairs room was small and didn't contain much, other than a bunch of messes. I went downstairs and the door was secured by a level 50 lock. I cracked it open with a spell and entered through. This spot was seemingly a lot tidier, more organized, and lived in. I came across someone named Gardig the Bold. I asked the Nord about Drum and he said that he was his boss. Knowing that I was getting warmer, I searched a little more and ended up finally finding the counselor. He opened by saying that he's going to have to take more precautions into not being found, but asks what he can do for me. I inquire about the Hlaalu Hortator and ask for his vote. He willingly gives it to me, as I have gone through the trouble of finding him. He warns me though that the next two votes aren't going to be so easy. Velanda and Nevena will only do as Orvas Dren tells them, and I will need to gain his approval first. I figured what's the point in seeking out the other two before Dren, if the game is heavily hinting at doing so. Uncle Crassius told me that he has a plantation in the Ascadian Isles. I got lucky in mistaking it for the herd of Netch just north of the city. It turns out that following one of the pathways there leads to a shoreline, and just beyond it, a massive compound. I made my way over there, and lo and behold, it was Orvas Dren's plantation. Everyone here had an incredibly low disposition towards me. Nobody wanted to speak with me, much less tell me where I could find Dren. Fortunately, one of the buildings ended up giving it away, as it was called Dren's Villa. I wandered around for a bit and found it quite odd that I couldn't rest, as apparently there were enemies nearby. Going all the way upstairs, I laid eyes on the man of the hour. He was clad in orcish armor and right off the bat gave off some pretty bad impressions.
No, you have no manners.
He asked what I wanted and I inquired about the Hlaalu Hortator. He says that since I sought him out, I show great wisdom for an outlander, but he questions what I want with the title. I'm prompted to either tell him my story and ask for his endorsement, or to tell him I wish to defeat Dagoth and bring peace to Morrowind. Choosing the former, he throws it back in my face by mocking my journey and claiming that he doesn't care about prophecies. He asks why I haven't been named Hortator already if I'm the so-called chosen one. Dren ends the conversation by saying I've wasted his time. I try again and this time tell him I wish to take down the 6th house for Morrowind. This has an even worse effect as now he's become hostile towards me. He tells me that he's already sided with the 6th house and that together they'll crush the Empire and the Tribunal. He claims that I'm his enemy and says it's time for me to die. Orvas begins attacking me and it's clear that I'm no match. Even if I decide to stand up against him, it turns out that he has a role to play in other quests for this game, so I didn't want to kill him right now. This is again where I use the help of the unofficial wiki. It tells me there are 2 other options. One is to raise his disposition above 50 or so, and then I can convince him that way. The other is to recover some hidden documents from the lower level of his villa. The basement area, however, contains a little surprise. The key to unlocking the doors is on Dren's desk just below him. Standing on the other side of the doors are 2 Dunmer lackeys who gang up on me. This one was a tough fight. I died a bunch and wasn't sure how to handle it. Eventually, I came up with another Morrowind strategy that involved exiting the villa and going back in via the other door. Doing so, I could charge up an attack with my halberd and let it off. After a few hits, I would leave the building and repeat the process. Shortly thereafter, both of the Dunmer were defeated. Going back down to the lower level, there were a bunch of locked containers that I could try to get into. It turns out, the small chest on the shelving contained the documents I needed. My unlock spell though was only good for level 50 locks and below. The small chest was a level 75 lock, so I had to get a stronger spell. Temporarily leaving the plantation, I traveled to the Vivec Mages Guild and teleported to the Aldrun Hall. Here, I created a spell with Hlaalu that would get that container open. I also decided to see if buying a charming spell was the better option, but as it turns out, I couldn't even afford to buy one, so I just let it be. Returning back to the plantation and cracking open the chest, inside I found a letter called Dren's Note. Reading it, it's addressed to 2 people, Rains and Neville. In it, Dren threatens to have his own brother killed as he's interfering with his trade. His brother is the Duke of Ebonheart, and this letter in the right hands would surely stir the pot. I take the letter back up to Orvas and speak with him. This time, regarding the Hortator, I have a third prompt, to show him the papers. He calls me out on snooping and putting my nose in places it shouldn't be, but recognizes the gravity of the situation. He endorses me as Hortator and says that he'll send word to Navina and Valanda about his change of heart. Exiting the villa, it's now time to find the final 2 counselors. It's funny how the most difficult person to convince on this matter wasn't even a member of House Hlaalu. Anyways, Navina and Valanda weren't too difficult to locate, but it did take some educated guesses and direction following to get to them. Starting with Valanda, I knew that she was on an island to the east of Vivec called Elmus Island. Looking at the map, there was a pretty obvious landmass that I assumed it to be. Hopping around the perimeter of Vivec, so that way I could rest without it being illegal, I soon landed on the island and took a path directly to her manor. Entering inside and going all the way upstairs, I located Valanda and asked her about being named Hortator. She was quick to hand me her vote, claiming that it was already a done deal. Easy enough, I left her house and just had to gain the vote of Navina. My journal said she was located near the town of Saran. I had never been there before, but it was incredibly familiar sounding. This was where I remembered that the town is accessible via Siltstrider out of Balmora. Returning back to Old Reliable and speaking with the caravaner, I arrived at the new place. Literally picking any random establishment to go inside of, just out of curiosity, I ended up picking Desle's House of Earthly Delights. Inside was a scene I had never come across before in any of the Elder Scrolls games. The bartenders were practically naked, and there were almost naked dancers performing on a stage at the back. Surprisingly, I think I recognized their choreography from an old Gamerpoop video made by Manslayer, way back in the day. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, I'd love to know that I'm not crazy. Anyways, I left the House of Earthly Delights and followed the directions to get to Navina's Manor. I took the road north out of town which led west. Just across the bridge, I laid eyes on a house. Entering inside and ascending upstairs, I found the final counselor. She opened up by congratulating me on my negotiations with Orvas Dren, showing that word has no doubt spread about our quote-unquote compromise. I asked to be named Hortator, and similar to Valanda, she agrees to give me her vote without hesitation. She reminded me that once I have everyone's vote, I should speak again with Crassius Curio. Heeding her advice, I traveled back to Vivec and went inside of his manor. I quickly decided to sleep in a private chamber as I wanted my bars replenished. I was yet again attacked by an ash zombie, which at this point was the third recorded time. Returning back to Uncle Crassius, I spoke with him and he said he was glad to see me. I asked about the Hlaalu Hortator and he was ecstatic to hear that all of the counselors agreed on the vote. He said it's what I deserved and called me Pumpkin. He honors me with the belt of the Hortator, a symbolic piece to recognize my title within House Hlaalu. He tells me to put it on snug around my supple little waist. Ending the conversation, he says not to be a stranger and that Uncle Crassius could always use some company. With that, thus ends the quest, Hlaalu Hortator.